Welcome back to Chapter 20's video on hypotheses tests for proportions. All right, so we just went over the whether or not we're allowed to write our hypotheses tests or hypotheses, your null and your alternative, a certain way. And that's what we just ended off with. So let's again move on. So one of the very first problems in our homework has us looking at how to write your null and alternative hypotheses. So again, I'm going to give you some time here to take a look at them. And I want to know, um, would you use, uh, well, how would you write them? How would you write your H sub O and H sub A? Right, so all three of them, there's actually three. There's an A, B, and C, and B really has nothing really to do with A, although some of my kids were asking about that, but um, they're all separate questions. So A, so have you read it. So again, his political committee pays for a series of TV ads, hoping that they can keep the negatives below 30%. So your your null hypothesis is that 30%. That's the status quo. And your alternative hypothesis, given the context clues in the problem, we're looking for below 30%. So we're looking for less than. So again, here's our parameter. There's our P, there's our 30%, and there's less than. All right, so BS is a coin fair. It's not a yes or no question. Again, we're looking how do you write your null and alternative hypotheses from this. So uh, hopefully you understand that a coin has either a heads or a tail. Therefore, you have 50% chance of getting one or the other. And that's the whole point, to be able to figure out H sub A. Your null hypothesis is P is equal to 50%. Well, it's either one or the other. Hopefully that makes sense to you, that it's not going to be less than or greater than, but it's actually going to be not equal. So you have heads or you don't have heads. And then lastly, you are given 20% of the people who try to quit smoking succeed. And then sellers of motivational tape claim that listening to the recorded message can help. Hopefully the context clues help you with your H sub A, can help people quit. So your null hypothesis is P is equal to 20%. Again, there's your 20%. And given the context clues here, again, if you were the seller of motivational tapes, you want them to have more. You want more people to quit. So the H sub A is equal to your P is greater than that 20%. So again, that looks like this. All right, so now that we've actually taken a look at some hypotheses examples, let's go on to our steps. So again, I mentioned this earlier. We have our 5-step process. So we've talked about our parameters and we've talked about the hypothesis statements. So next is the assumptions. So hopefully let's go through our assumptions that we must look at. Since again, this is a z-test, so we are looking for our normal. We have to make sure that we do those same things. So you must check to see if it's random. You must um, check to see if you have enough successes and enough failures. But and again, we do that by NP is greater than or equal to 10, and same thing with NQ. And then lastly, we have our 10% rule. So hopefully, again, these three things look familiar to you since we've done those in the last 2 chapters. So yay, the same assumptions as our confidence intervals. So there's nothing new. All right, so we've talked about the parameters, the hypotheses, and the assumptions. Let's go on to our calculations where we're actually finding our p-values. All right, p-values are the probability that the test statistic would have a value as extreme or more than what is actually observed. So again, we're looking to see if our null hypothesis is not true. We're going to reject it. That's what we would like. If we are going to try to prove that your alternate hypothesis is valid. So that's what they're talking about here. So that means we're going to try to look at something that's significant, that's statistically significant, far away, extreme from the actual observed values. So the level of significance is important. Excuse me. It's the amount of evidence necessary before we begin to doubt that the null hypothesis is true. So if we're kind of a little thinking of our alternative hypothesis, if you're even thinking about an alternative hypothesis, you're kind of, the null hypothesis isn't straight, it doesn't make sense, something's not quite right with it. So that's what we're talking about in the first bullet here. So again, you're going to look for evidence for that. And the second bullet is talking about is the probability that we will reject the null hypothesis. Again, if we reject it, that means the alternative hypothesis is valid, and we're assuming that the null hypothesis is true. So again, that the level of significance, if we get a level of significance that shows that we're allowed to reject it, then our alternative is going to be valid. So our level of significance is denoted here by alpha, and it technically can be used as any value, but we generally will default that value to 5%. But again, it can be 1%, 10%, whatever. But generally, we're going to be using 5 most of our homework. Okay, so let's talk about what's statistically significant. And again, it deals with a p-value and what our value actually is. So you're going to get an answer for a p-value, and the p-value is as small or smaller than the level of significance. Again, so that's what we're looking for. And so let's go to through the two cases that we could have. We can have our p-value is greater than our alpha. And if it's greater, then unfortunately our null hypothesis is valid. We failed to reject the null hypothesis. There's not sufficient evidence to say anything that's significantly true about the alternative or alternate hypothesis. But the second or the third bullet here is if your p-value is less than or equal to your alpha, you are allowed to reject the null hypothesis at that level. And again, when you reject your null hypothesis, that's stating that your alternative hypothesis is valid. So again, the only two things that you're allowed to say when you're making your decision is fail to reject and reject. So let's talk about some facts that we are allowed about our p-values. Excuse me. And again, I'll pause here. Our time is running short. So I'm going to pause here and come back. So I'll see you in just a bit.